Hello, I'm Paul Hayes. Welcome. Welcome to a new philosophy. It's called Investorship. It's a philosophy I hope you'll find interesting, compelling, want to know more about, and hopefully subscribing to as a philosophy that becomes your own. The term is investorship. It suggests investing, but more specifically, it's a philosophy about financial decision making. One of the great people in the financial world as an investor is a fellow named John Bogle. He started what is now one of the largest financial firms in the nation, and he once was quoted as having said something that was profound and brilliant. He said that to be an investor, you have to first and foremost be a philosopher. And that's so true. And yet most people today that consider themselves to be investors are not philosophers. They've adopted a philosophy that seems to be the relevant philosophy that underpins the financial industry, and that is that you need to have help figuring out what to invest in, and you need to have somebody else really be the decision maker for you in financial decision makings. Investorship philosophy is very different. What I've come to understand over the last basically a career, but certainly since retirement, is that it isn't what people invest in that causes them to become successful financially. It's how they do it. It's what their behavior is, how they behave relevant to investing. And that's very different than the financial community that would say it's what you invest in that's everything. What you invest in is important, but it's not the cause of wealth. It's a source of wealth, but the cause of wealth is the behavior, the individual, how they go about the practice of investing. And so investorship is going to talk a lot about that how, and it's going to be very different than what you've probably focused on in the past. You know, Socrates was a great philosopher, and he once said that there's no surer sign of a person's education and intellect than their ability, willingness, and propensity to put aside their beliefs and convictions long enough and often enough to discover new things on which to base them. Such an important concept. And how important it is that we not just give lip service to it, but we practice it. Mark Twain, the great author, once said, "It isn't what we don't know that hurts us. It's what we know for sure that just ain't so." You know, there's so much that we think we know that on real scrutiny may not be right at all. And so much of what people tell you that they think they know that just ain't so. So the key is to understand that many of the things we think we understand may be wrong, and that may need to be replaced by new thinking, by new concepts, new bases for future behaviors. That's what investorship is about. When I started in the investment business in 1973, there was an article published, I think it was in Fortune magazine, it doesn't matter, it was a very prominent magazine at the time, and it was authored by two individuals, Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley, and Amos Tversky, a psychologist at Stanford University. And the two of them had collaborated over many years and had published what they called prospect theory. And it was an interesting and a valuable concept and theory, and that is that people, when confronted with making a decision, behave very differently when in different environments. Specifically, people when confronted with a loss make a very different kind of decision than when confronted with a corresponding gain of the same amount. And when they're confronted with a loss, they make a much higher risk decision. They entertain much higher risk kinds of activities than they do when they're confronted with that corresponding gain. And I thought at the time, this is a profound piece of work that has enormous applications in the financial field, because that's where people are confronted with gains and loss of a financial nature. And you know, if people's behavior can be brought to their attention and how it can be pointed out that when confronted with this set of circumstances, you may be making a different kind of decision than over here when you're confronted with different circumstances, it could help people make better decisions. But the financial community has been so supportive of the idea of it's what you invest in that you need to focus on, that they've gone to a very large degree to ignore some of the behavioral aspects of their own clients. In 2003, Daniel Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Prize for economics. He's a psychologist. He was the first non-economist to ever get the Nobel Prize for economics. And he was awarded the prize on the basis of his contribution to the economic theories that prevailed at the time. Specifically, the economic theory that people, when confronted with a decision, will gather the facts, they'll weigh the facts on the basis of relevance and on the basis of importance, and then they'll make a rational decision. And Daniel Kahneman basically said, yeah, sometimes they do that, but they don't always. Sometimes their emotions intervene and deprive them of the ability to make rational decisions, or they will introduce errors in judgment into the whole decision-making process. And those errors in judgment can cause very smart people to make very, very expensive mistakes. The old adage that if you don't know yourself, Wall Street is the best place to learn, or it's the most important, most expensive place to learn. It's not the best place to learn, but if you don't know who you are and you go to Wall Street, you'll learn at a very expensive rate. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist, in 2012, went on to publish a book that became a bestseller immediately on the New York Times bestseller list. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a wonderful book about our nature, about how we think, and he talks about thinking fast and slow. Not that one is better than the other, because at times you have to think fast. Your survival may depend on it. At other times, you need to think slow. And if you think too fast and don't think enough about a subject or a decision, you may find yourself having made a very costly error. He uses an example in the book, which I think is a great one. He says, you know, a bat and a ball cost $1.10. And then he says the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? Well, if the bat and the ball together cost $1.10 and the bat costs $1, the ball costs 10 cents, right? I mean, it's an easy question to answer. And 99% of the time, people will say, you know, yeah, it costs 10 cents. But it's wrong. It can't be right. If the ball costs 10 cents and the bat costs $1 more, the bat costs $1.10. And if the bat costs $1.10 and you add a 10-cent ball to it, you've got $1.20. But the question started off saying the bat and the ball cost $1.10. So the first and easiest and quickest answer that comes to mind, that most people are willing to, you know, stake their life on almost, is wrong. And they don't take the time to slow down and think about it and think about their answer and back test it. You know, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball and the ball costs 10 cents, the bat and the ball cost $1. The bat costs $1.10. The 10-cent ball makes it $1.20. It can't be right. So how do you solve the problem? Well, you can fall back on your basic algebra, which is the basis for deciding A plus B equals whatever. Or you could just say, well, we know it's not 10 cents because that was just proven wrong. So I'll plug in another number. How about if it was a nickel? Well, if the ball cost a nickel, the bat would cost $1.05. And if the bat cost $1.05 and the ball was 5 cents, you'd have $1.10. So bingo, you've got the right answer. But you had to slow down. And you had to back up and not jump at the first answer. So an awful lot about investorship is going to be about thinking fast and slow, applying some of these known principles, these scientific facts governing our behavior. About 20 years ago, about the time I was retiring, this whole idea of behavioral finance was just starting to evolve as a legitimate scientific basis for financial decision making or making better financial decisions. And there's been a lot written on the subject of behavioral finance, and investorship as a philosophy is grounded on this body of knowledge. One of the best books I've ever read on the subject of behavioral finance is Psychology of Investing by John Nofsinger. John is a professor at a major American university, and he writes wonderfully on the subject. Enough detail to let us understand clearly, but not in a scientific way. He's not trying to write for the scientific journals. He's trying to write for you and me so that we can understand these concepts. And I recommend this book wholeheartedly. It's published by the successor of Prentice Hall. It's now Pearson Publishing. But it's a wonderful book. It's available on Amazon or probably in any of the better bookstores. But I recommend reading it. I also recommend reading another book that John is in the process of co-authoring with me. It's called Spending Your Way to Wealth. John and I have teamed up to try to put more substance into this philosophy of spending, this investorship philosophy, and turn it into more than a book or something you just read and forget, but turn it into something that lives within you, so that when you make a decision, a financial decision, this whole process of thinking about the long-term consequences of this decision comes to mind, so that when you reach for that second latte, and we're not trying to put the latte business out of business, but when you reach for that second latte today, you think about the consequences. I'm 75 years old. I have a granddaughter that starts university in 10 years. My wife and I enjoy a bottle of wine with dinner. And, you know, a $15 bottle of wine seems like it's, you know, reasonable. You go into the grocery store, you see bottles of wine that are $30 and $50 and $70, which seems frivolous to me. $15, yeah, it's something we can afford. But, you know, if you put a $15 bottle and a $10 bottle of wine in front of me and gave me a blind test, I'm not sure I could tell you which was which. In fact, I'll bet 50% of the time I'd pick the $10 bottle of wine. So I said, well, what if I took that $5 extra and buy the $10 bottle of wine for dinner, and I took that $5 and I just put it into an S&P index fund, the same thing that money for the latte went into, just an average, plain Jane, Standard & Poor index fund, and I did that for 10 years. I'd have about another $30,000 as a result of that investment, assuming that the past 85 years of average returns was the same that we had in the next 10 years. It's a reasonable assumption. It's not a pie in the sky, get rich queen. It's just a highly likely rate of return. And $30,000 extra in 10 years is enough to probably get her nicely established in some college of her choice. So I've chosen to have $10 bottles of wine and to fund that extra $5 a night into her college fund. That's not giving up much, but it's taking a small expenditure and looking at it through the lens of only 10 years. Think what that would be if it went out 20 or 30 or 40 years. We're talking about a few dollars that grows to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions. So that's what investorship's about. We welcome you aboard. We hope you'll stay tuned, stay alert to the concept of investorship, think about it, and tune in again for another version of Investorship Insights. Thanks for viewing, and thanks for welcome aboard.